Is Microsoft Unified Support busting your IT budget? You're not alone. US Cloud is the global leader in third-party Microsoft enterprise support. And we're helping enterprises slash support costs by 30 to 50% versus Microsoft Unified, all while getting faster response times from domestic engineers. No offshoring, no long waits, just expert support you can count on 24/7 by 365. Trusted by 50 of the Fortune 500 and offering senior-level engineers with an average of 14 years experience with Microsoft technologies, US Cloud is the smarter alternative for premium Microsoft support without the premium price. Ready to make the switch? Book a call at uscloud.com to get started.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Brian and I have been, I'll say, observing some emerging trends on the developer side here recently, and we decided it's time to explore several of these trends and their potential impact, both now and here in the near future. So today we're going to cover what is top of mind in the API space and potential impacts of both AI as well as Model Context Protocol, or MCP for short. And all of that is coming up right after this short break. This episode is sponsored by Postman. Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform, and they just launched Postman AI Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. Start building at postman.com/podcast/cloudcast.
And we're back and excited to dive into this one today because we've been talking a lot about, obviously a lot of things on the show. We talk about developers, we talk about APIs, we talk about AI, we talk about cloud. And I feel like sometimes we sort of silo what we're getting into. We don't really talk about a lot of the intersections between these things. And right now, so much is evolving and so much is changing, whether it's how code's going to be built, how teams are interacting around more complex applications, all those types of things. And we kind of wanted to take an opportunity to really dig into what some of those interesting interactions are today. And so really excited to have Taylor Pechacek, who is head of product for API Collaboration Core at Postman, joining us today from Boston. Taylor, welcome to the show. Great to have you on.
Hey, Brian, really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, excited to have you because I know, we've been obviously doing some work with Postman here recently. Before we dive into a lot of this, give us a little bit of your background, kind of, your background, but also what you focus on these days at Postman.
Sure. Yeah. So I did a few startups coming out of grad school, kind of in the healthcare space, all in the product management side, thinking about front-end development, product management. And then I joined Atlassian about 7.5 years ago, 8 years ago, and just had a really incredible journey there, building out products, and was really on the side of that company that was thinking about how software teams actually collaborate, how they build things, how they operate stuff. And that was really working on things within Jira Software. I looked at a lot of the integrations work. So how does get information, CI/CD, feature flags, essentially answering those questions of like, hey, is this issue deployed or not? Right? How do we know the status of work? Because the work was kind of happening across all of these tools, but it wasn't really happening back in Jira. And so how do you kind of bring that context and help people just move work forward? Right. And then the last 3 years was really fascinating. We built a product from the ground up called Compass at Atlassian. And that was really in this internal developer portal space. And we were competing with things like Backstage from Spotify, which is an open source version. There's a handful of startups there, Cortex, Port, a few others. And, Atlassian had been on that same journey internally. A lot of microservices moving to the cloud, increasing complexity for developers. They had also invested heavily in kind of their internal compute platform, called Micros. And then we wanted to build a front-end portal for that. And we saw so many customers also investing in developer experience, the portal side of things, and how to really make sense across all of these different tools that were being given to developers internally. And we packaged that up, and that was built out as Compass. And so had a wonderful time there. Really loved that company, a lot of good memories made. And so I thought it was the right time for me to leave. Had a really great role and opportunity to join Postman. And I've been there for about 7 or 8 months. And what was really fascinating about Postman was that they had this amazing tool. And let me pause there for a second and tell a little bit about what Postman is before I continue. So Postman, for those who don't know, is really this kind of end-to-end collaboration platform for APIs, right? So if you're developing APIs, designing APIs, operating them, it's really going to handle everything you need to be able to track those, to build against them, to test them. And you can do that with yourself, of course, and you can do that with now a group of people and even across the entire company.
Yeah.
Right. And it really started many years ago in kind of sending this request response from an API. And so an API being an application programming interface, you would hit that API. So if we're using Atlassian Jira, hey, get issue, it would return the results from a data perspective of what's on that Jira issue, and the assigning and stuff. And so what I saw really through my time at Atlassian was more and more developers and software teams were spending time trying to figure out how to deal with two or more services or APIs or parts of these products. And they needed to stitch them together. They needed to assemble them. And Postman is just right here in the middle of this because it's the entire communication layer of how technology kind of communicates back and forth, right? And it's through your HTTP REST APIs. You can move into other things that are more event-driven. There's new standards, of course, with GraphQL and stuff. And so, joining Postman now, what I think about a lot, still software teams, still collaboration, but really thinking about it from the perspective of how can we help people assemble that software through the use of these APIs. And so I think a lot about how a group of 10 people might want to use Postman to make their lives easier, to be able to build faster, to be able to build higher quality APIs in that way.
Yeah, and that's a great place to start because so much of, as we get a chance to talk to development teams, there's always interest in the thing that they're building. And then there's always this sort of like pause or a sigh, and they go, but I spend so little of my time, writing code, right? There's so many other things that I've got to keep up with. It's this system, it's that system. It's almost like they've got flows in their mind. They've got sort of workflow in their mind, and they're always constantly kind of, I don't want to say fighting, but like kind of struggling with, just do certain tools kind of help them, accelerate what they're doing, or are they kind of, pushing against it and so forth. So it feels like we're going to get into a lot of pretty interesting stuff today. Again, just so we kind of can level set with folks that are listening, let's start with some real basic concepts. If you're a developer, you're a small team, you're working on a project or a service, like where in today's world are they interacting with software typically, like they're building something versus, more so, they're interacting with APIs, right? They're having to bring together kind of an entire experience. Like, what are the most important things in today's modern developer world in which those things, how do they think about those two things either separately or together?
Yeah, that's a great place to start and a really good question. I think one way to kind of frame this is we can kind of go through the life cycle of, let's say we're starting something really small and we're creating our first service together. So you and I are in a startup, we're building something, we want to create something. We'll probably consist of a couple things, right? We'll have our back end, we'll have some compute, we'll have some storage, we'll have some networking, and then we'll have our front end. We'll probably render that to people through UI of some kind. And a lot of times when you start with that, you're going to build development where you're essentially interacting with data in some way. And how you want to test that is, you can go much quicker by just using a REST client like Postman to be able to mock out, hey, let's get some data, let's post some data, let's modify that data, let's see how it looks in the UI. And so we're actually going to use that. That is, you could call it testing, but I actually really think it's much more, a much better way to describe it might be that you're debugging or you're building and you're kind of testing the limits of said system. And so you're kind of really in this build mode that you're trying to understand what you're working with. And as you kind of build that out, Postman has a lot of mechanisms to be able to even test that API to the second person. Okay. So I may not have deployed my local host application yet, but the contract I've created through the API is there. And I want to know if you on the front end who are going to go work on building out this UI with maybe a list of things and different buttons that you can press to update stuff, you can trust that contract, right? And you can build against it. And now we can start to do things in parallel.
Yeah.
And so I can go work on my back end. I might change even my entire language. I might change my entire system design, but you have that contract to rely on. And so the APIs are really there to help people understand, hey, what capabilities does this piece of technology offer? And it is the interface that describes that capability. And that gives a really, really a large amount of power in terms of working with other people. So now if we expand out and we have 10 people in our team, right? How do we kind of come back to those APIs, understand which ones are meant to be trusted? APIs themselves are often blueprints. So you might have 20 parameters that you could pass in, right? What are some of those patterns? Hey, get me the issues, or give me some data from Slack and all these channels that have these filters, or maybe bulk update a thing, or notify across a set of channels. There's probably a few ways you might use that API that you can start to impose as examples, and people can pick that up. They have all the different authentication mechanisms within that, and they can really quickly get up and going to start to build against that. So I think, like, if I were to zoom way out, and before we get to kind of the standards and the governance at large scales, within that 1 to 10 person team, it's really this back and forth between the underlying software, like the compute, like what is it doing, and the interface that it gives you. Like even AI, if we talk about AI, you're calling an API to essentially give a query, and you're going to get some non-deterministic result kind of back, right? But at the end of the day, it's still this: I have a request, something's going to do something, some black box that's there,
right?
And I think it's more black than before, and so it's getting darker, and so, but it's going to give me a result. And how I work around that is really how we think about APIs and the interfaces, and then it becomes mapping that out across a sequence diagram. Or if you're familiar with, people are familiar with sequence diagrams, you're going to call this API, then you're going to call this one, then you'll do some, compute on your data, and then you'll call the next one, and so on. And that's a great way to think about that in terms of these flows or these sequence diagrams that you want to work with. And Postman thinks a lot about how those group of people work on that.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on a couple of things that to me resonated a ton, because I have this saying I try and explain to people all the time that, like, nowadays every sort of business project is a technical project sort of waiting behind it. So business team sits around, they come up with some idea for, getting into the market, doing something, delivering something new for customers. And there's always, it's no longer like go to a physical store, do this thing. It's, how are we going to implement this in the mobile app, in the kiosk, in whatever. And so there's an aspect of it that, the business owner is going like, I'd like this experience to happen. Like, I can imagine in my mind what this experience would happen. And that's, to me, very much the things you were talking about, like the ability to kind of experiment, to validate that things work, to do it in small teams, but to validate it with, external groups. But at the same time, once you've sort of proven that to somebody, that you can show that to somebody, I mean, their immediate expectation is like, okay, great. When can this go into production? And that's, to me, very much the whole idea of, these APIs sort of serve as contracts for, what that overall experience is going to look like. You can build security around it, but you're very much understanding that's my interaction with those people, and you can build process and flow and things around that. So I think the way that you explained that was fantastic, because it helped me kind of connect the dots between, the way a business owner, whether it's a product manager or, even a general manager working with people, trying to map that down into the technology, and then the way that software developers have to kind of, again, build it, reverse engineer it, and then life cycle it so that it, it can go out and scale and do stuff is really interesting.
One thing, if I might add there before we move on to the next question, is that I think, to your point, like thinking in this way, AI is accelerating that mental model, because you have the ability for this like smart bot or agent or whatever you want to call it, that is able to kind of write the underlying Lego pieces, right? The underlying code that's going to execute on your idea.
Right.
You can call it vibe coding. You just go for it, and just let it ride. But at the end of the day, no matter what you do, you have to have some interface that is going to access that thing. There's some like yeah, translation layer, right? And that's always going to exist, whether that's AI, whether it's REST APIs. And I think that's really interesting that's going to always exist. And so what you can do is you can start to be a little bit more API first in your thinking. You can start to be a little bit more, hey, this is what I want to achieve. And a lot of the technology we're building is actually coming in to support that abstraction. And most of technology is adding a new layers of abstraction. And I think we're kind of coming to that point. You have it with AI and being able to abstract across all this knowledge base.
Yep.
But then also with APIs, I think having its moment in terms of being able to access, and we'll get into that with how AI calls these APIs. They call them tools, right? And so, but people on the ground, people who may not be developers, they have business problems. Everybody has like these problems they want to solve. And I think the faster we can help translate that into some working piece of software, is really exciting.
Yeah.
And it's usually going to be the combination of two or more of these discrete pieces of technology.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I feel like about once a year or so, we kind of go explore the API space. And we've had a chance to have a number of people on, similar to yourself, sort of live in this space all the time. It's not a side thing. And I always feel like there are so many new kind of concepts coming out. Like you mentioned GraphQL, and there's certain specifications. We talk about REST APIs and others. Like, are we seeing more standardization around APIs? Are we seeing more consistent frameworks, or is it still kind of the way it is with programming languages? People kind of pick the ones they like, and stuff can be made up of whatever programming language.
Yeah. Okay. I think it definitely isn't as broad as like maybe the languages and other things. There's definitely some dominant patterns. I think if you look at kind of the different protocols that are out there, we can bucket those into kind of two large camps, and maybe a third now with AI. But the first camp is kind of this request response, right? And it's HTTP, GraphQL, these types of formats. And then there's also kind of event driven. So with async API. And those two kind of have their own paths here. And HTTP still being very dominant. I think the reason that GraphQL came out was that you wanted to optimize for the consumer to not have to stitch together 6 different REST APIs.
Yeah.
But to say, I actually just need name, field, data. So it's like an auto join of a table.
Right.
It goes and does all of its stuff. And then it optimizes for people consuming. So again, really big improvement on the developer experience. And so that saw a lot of traction, which is great. And then the third one I think would be kind of AI. I think this new kind of non-deterministic, I don't really know what I'm going to get back, but I'm going to get something back and I might do something with it. That introduces all these interesting problems with how we design systems that historically have been very deterministic. So, I get a request, I send it back. I kind of expect what I'm going to get, so I can write tests and other things around it.
Yeah.
That's going to change quite a bit with AI on the third side.
So it's interesting, and we're gonna dive into some more of the AI stuff in a bit. But like, you actually think about kind of these queries into LLMs and stuff as almost like an API, like a non-deterministic API. I mean, is that kind of a way you think about it as a category, maybe?
Kind of, yeah. I don't think we've really nailed that down internally. It's part of a lot of discussion. I mean, even if you take flows, which is one of the products that we have within Postman, and you're able to chain together various different APIs to create kind of a workflow, right? An automation, like a workflow. And what we've kind of launched recently is looking into these AI agent builders.
Okay.
And really the unlock there is that you can add a step in that flow that you can ask an LLM to like make some call. Tell me whether it's this or that. And depending on what the LLM tells you. So let's say like, here's a bunch of data. I'll give you a real example. Here's a bunch of data from Slack, a Jira issue, something in the observability tool. You tell me what severity this should be as an incident.
Oh, okay.
And you don't really know what it's going to tell you, right?
Yeah.
And over time you have to train. This is what I mean by like, how do you train that? What is it like trained on? How does it start working? How do you get to a really good level that's maybe just, okay, now it's good to go. But you don't really know. And so you can think about that problem and you can apply that to so many areas that you might want to predict something, and you can embed that in your flow. And so now you have this, let's say there are 10 steps and 3 of those may fork at any given time.
Yeah.
depending on how open-ended the responses are and how many paths you want to kind of add to that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think this non-deterministic nature of you give it a bunch of context, you ask it a question, and then if it does something, that's why giving it access to tools is such a fascinating problem, because it's really cool at first glance. But what does that mean in terms of security, accidentally wiping
Yeah.
out your entire database?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
these APIs are giving you, keys to the kingdom
Right.
for
Right.
many of these APIs.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it. I think maybe I had thought about it as like, well, people were building things on top of, say, like the Open API or the OpenAI API is sort of a thing, but the rest of it was just sort of data interaction. But I guess if, like you said, if you just sort of break down what an API is fundamentally doing, it's sort of requesting or interacting with data and then doing something upon it. So, and I like that. Let's.
Well, I had a couple more to add to the standards. If maybe
Go ahead.
come back.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So I think the other thing within the standards. So let's take the HTTP REST API, which is still such a dominant force in the world.
Right.
You really want to think about a few standards there that have come out around the OpenAPI spec.
Mm-hmm.
And why does that exist? Why does the specification exist? I think why it exists is that you want something that can be very portable, that's very consistent, and is really kind of tool agnostic, let's call it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times when you're working with, APIs and Postman and you're building all these out and you're saving them as your collections. So you might have a collection that's like if you're a library, you might have like a, book collection. So you can update books, read books, have all these different endpoints and these interfaces that give you that. Being able to export that or vice versa, like compile that from the code.
Mm-hmm.
You have the underlying endpoints, which is, we talked about that. That's the actual code, the implementation. There's compute behind that. And then you need something to represent that. And that is usually this OpenAPI spec, which has been pretty dominant, as well as Postman collections. A lot of people kind of use those collections and OpenAPI specs kind of together.
Okay.
But again, most software teams already have Git, right? We've all standardized on this. And there's the kind of three major players: GitHub, Bitbucket, and GitLab, I would say, and GitHub being by far the dominant force in that world.
Sure.
And so being able to work with Git and those protocols, which means, what does that mean? That means that you have access to the pull request flows. And on every pull request, you have access to be able to shift left. You have the ability to run tests on every PR change. And you have the ability to kind of get embedded in that really core developer workflow as they move things more towards production. And so being able to check for breaking changes, being able to understand the endpoints, that's a powerful mechanism there that you want to be able to work really closely with. And so Postman's thinking a lot about how they work closely with Git and Postman, because you're going to do all of your the executable, the documentation, how you actually work with those API, all of that's happening in Postman.
Yeah. Yeah. We've been talking a bunch about sort of, development within a team, smaller teams interacting with a couple of services. As the team either grows or as things become more pervasive in larger organizations, you start to get into, kind of best practices, governance, all those types of things. Like, what are the kind of important things that people should be thinking about, whether it's around usage patterns and governance, or what are some of the things that Postman's doing to, again, like we talked about, sort of make things easier for developers?
I love this question. So I spent many years thinking about, like, let's call it common developer problems. Like, what is governance? Governance is like, I have 1,000 developers. I've got 1,000 repos, 1,000 workspaces in Postman. How do I deal with that complexity?
Yeah.
And I think it's this really great model. I think platform engineering has driven this a lot forward. Kind of this, you had Agile, you have DevOps. I think platform engineering has added a lot to that conversation. And what it's added is really around being able to build happy paths or build like things that are, hey, here's the right way to do things is this way. Mm-hmm. And it's really easy for you. And if you want to break out of that, of course, you need to innovate, you need to go do different stuff. But for most of development, most of these teams, they have a lot already built out for them, And so I would make the argument that, like, take Google or Meta, their developers, like even a new developer coming in is probably like a level 99 warlock, super powerful, comes in and just is able to work quite effectively relative to maybe a startup that doesn't have the same tool set, the same investment, And that's relative to the size of the code base and complexity. And so when you think about this governance, one of the things we're doing within Postman is thinking about how you have all these endpoints, right? So it starts with endpoints, starts with these requests.
Yep.
And what you want to really do is start to think about the ownership of those requests and actually grouping them into what we call collections.
Okay.
And a collection is is essentially a piece of technology that has those interfaces. And so this kind of gets into service design or domain-driven design, but you want to think about okay, I have a library. Let's go back to the library example. I have something with books. I have something with users. I probably have something around search. And so you might want to build a collection for each of those building blocks of your app. And each building block has a set of APIs by it, it's a set of endpoints. And those are the interfaces that access the capabilities in that. And so when you think about this collection, this is where Postman gets really interesting. That collection, you can start to give it a life of its own. You can start to test against that. So you can say, I want to make sure all these endpoints are always running effectively. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure that they actually have good tests at the game, good tests. And so when I get results back, I expect certain results. And so if someone changes something in the code, you're actually going to get different results back. You can catch that, right? And then you can even check that ahead of time during your pull request flow. But the point is that you build out this collection in terms of the quality and the state of that thing. And you have this long running piece of technology that's like, wow, if someone wants to deal with books in my company, I should probably bring them to the books collection. Right. And they'll have everything they need to do there. They can fork that, they can work with it. And so one of the things that we're working on now, which really excited to kind of announce that's coming out, is two things. The first one is what we're calling Specification Hub or Spec Hub. And that's the ability to kind of integrate really tightly with Git, what I was just talking about with some of these portable OpenAPI specifications, and connect that back to the collection, right? So this books collection that we have, it is represented in Git. Any changes I make in code are represented in the collection in Postman as I work against it, and vice versa. As people work with that collection in Postman, it's going to be represented back in the code. So they have this kind of running kind of source of truth there across both. And so that's really exciting. You'll be able to kind of author these things. You'll be able to design these specs. You'll be able to generate. So you'll actually be able to take an entire OpenAPI spec, generate collections from it, generate the imports, and then work with that, run those APIs, test them, give them to colleagues, and kind of work with and collaborate together. And then the second thing that's really exciting is around typed collections. And this is just such a great, thing that should have been out for a while, but it's just such an awesome piece of technology. And that is essentially adding linting to these collections. And so how many times so many people have told us they come to a collection, hey, come check out this API, this books API, Brian. And you get there and you have no idea if it's required fields, if it's optional fields. You start hitting the API, you're getting 400s, you start getting frustrated. And so what the typed collection does is it adds these linting parameters to say, hey, this is what you need to fill out. If you didn't fill this out, it's going to give those error warnings back to you. And so the developer experience of using an API that you're not familiar with is going to be a lot better. And you can kind of set these rules, these governance kind of aspects across, hundreds of teams, hundreds of workspaces within Postman. And so it gives them a lot of kind of leeway to apply this governance, but still let people kind of work in their own way.
No, that's very cool. Very cool. Yeah, no, I mean, just, the amount of sort of collaboration you end up doing between teams, and do we have the right versions, and, when do they get onboarded, and just, all those things that you go, oh, those should be simple. Those should be they're never as simple as you think they are. So yeah, the fact that you guys are thinking about those in ways that are repeatable, shareable, versionable, that's fantastic. Very, very cool to see.
One last thing there, sorry, Brian. Yeah. And it just reminded me, the documentation piece is actually really important here, because I think most developers today, they still kind of have the documentation up to the right, and they're probably using Postman here to the left, and maybe their VS Code or some type of coding thing, and they're kind of working across this set here, and so they're looking at the docs to try and figure out, what's required, what's not, how do I work with it. I think Postman really views that as how do we collapse it so the documentation and the executable are just the same thing? Yeah. Why is that different? That's so weird, right? We should get to a world where that's the same thing, and then we're collaborating against that and evolving it and making sure that it has a stable representation, back in Git and things like that.
Yeah, no, that's very, very cool. I want to come back to, we kind of scratched the surface on API or on AI. We were kind of talking about it as kind of a non-deterministic, way of thinking about APIs or, just its interaction. But I'm curious just more holistically, because like you said, you spend a lot of your time thinking about developer interactions, how to make things easier, kind of what they're dealing with. What are you seeing in terms of, how AI is changing developers' work and how much that's going to kind of impact, APIs? Obviously, we hear a lot about, copilots and helping to write code or even, now autonomously writing some code. But like, how are you seeing it, or how are you thinking about, kind of what AI is starting to do in the developer space or, lifecycle space?
Well, there's so many ways to go about this question. I love it. So let me start with maybe the first thing I'll say is that AI is very much this horizontal purpose technology. I mean, I think we really believe that AI can be applied at every single step of the journey.
Okay.
And when you think about that, you think about like, where is it somewhere I can predict? Something's off track, boom, prediction. Mm-hmm. Ooh, something's, should it be an incident or not? Prediction, right? And so you want to think about kind of broadly these workflows and where you can start to embed AI within those. And then the other thing is that I think AI is helping developers write more code, right? And they're able to write more like code faster. We can debate the quality of that, I think, for a long time. I think we'll kind of sort that out over time. And there's agents that will actually check, what the person writing the code or the AI writing the code. So they'll just start to do stuff without us, I suppose.
Yeah.
But to your point earlier, let's say 30 to 40% of a developer's time is spent actually coding.
Yeah.
The rest of the time is kind of understanding specifications, thinking about the system that they're working within. How are they going to go about this? Should they add an endpoint to an existing service? Should they create an entirely new service? How do they think about? Everyone becomes kind of this mini architect, and the AI is there kind of helping them write this code to be able to fulfill that. And so, one, I think fundamentally that's going to create a lot more software. That's going to create a lot more discrete pieces of software, and it's going to create a lot more interfaces to them. And hence, I think there's going to be a tremendous explosion of APIs in the world. And how we reason about those, how people work with that complexity is a big question. Which one do I trust? Like, which model should I use? Like, how do I navigate all the stuff that's happening so quickly, and how do I test these things out? So that's one. I think we want to give people the ability to just work kind of what Postman did in its origins was like, hey, there's all these APIs out here. Like, how do I test it and validate that this is the one I need? Right? Okay. Yep. That's the data I get back. That's how it works. Cool. I'll pull this into my system. I think we want to do the same thing with AI in that regard. And then the second thing, going beyond that, is if there's going to be all this like new software, new discrete units, you want to help people craft or assemble software. And so we have a simple mechanism in Postman, kind of like Git, but you're able to take an API and you're able to fork that into your own workflows, right? Oh, I need to use the Books API. I will fork that, and I can actually edit it. I can make changes to it, and I can kind of push that back to the original API owner, right? And then it can kind of, maybe they might update the underlying code and other things there where they can push back what they want to occur, the interface.
Yeah.
And so what happens when you start to say, well, actually, you know what? Let me take my sequence diagram, and I know that I need to work across eight APIs across 8 different teams in this company. What if I could go into Postman and just, let me grab that one, fork into a working canvas, right? And so now I'm working with like the interfaces that I need, and I'm starting to assemble this small feature, this application that I'm kind of working on using those different APIs. And I have all the authentication sorted for me. I've got environments and variables sorted out for me. I can turn that into a flows or a visual diagram to kind of understand how this is actually working. I have all the debugging and responses I'm getting back to be able to work with that. So I think you're really starting to improve the developer experience when actually working across 2 or more of these systems. And I think it's a slightly better version than vibe coding.
Yeah.
I think it's a form of vibe coding, but you have a little bit of safety and quality that's kind of baked in there that companies are expressing through Postman, the platform, right? Like the companies impose that governance and they set those standards and authentication. And so, developers shouldn't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
They should be able to build.
No, that's cool. I want to. I kind of want, like you said, we could dive into a lot of things. I kind of want to wrap up and hit two topics with sort of one question. Obviously, we're seeing a lot discussed these days, and people are excited about this idea of AI agents or agentic AI. And at the same time, we're starting to see this new flurry of kind of protocols around this, right? One of them being MCP, Model Context Protocol. Google just came out with one called A2A, but I kind of want to focus on MCP because it seems to be, at least in the immediate term, on mid-April here, 2025, the one that a lot of different companies and projects are kind of rallying around. As you're thinking about this from an API perspective, or even just kind of the context, the way that you think about stuff getting built, how do you, what are the big things that people should be thinking about in terms of, do you think about agents as like a user? Do you think of it as a service? Have people started to wrap their head around, like, what does that mean from a security perspective? Like, just, I don't know, holistically, where do you see that space right now? And what are the things in that space that you're thinking about the most?
Yeah, it is moving really, moving really fast. I think the A2A announcement, I got to go read up on to understand a bit more. And even the Model Context Protocol, we're all kind of catching up. So I think with AI, I think with the agents, we started with a couple of things at Postman, which we're really excited about. The first one, we announced this a little bit a while ago, but the first one is that you can literally build agents, and you can interact with AI within Postman directly. Mm-hmm. So what do I mean by that? The first thing is that you can come in and there's a request type. So instead of calling HTTP, you're actually calling AI, and you're calling Anthropic's, you're calling OpenAI's APIs, and you're able to kind of like interact with these, see your token counts, see your response rates. You're able to get data around the effectiveness of which model you should use in what context. Okay. And then, as I mentioned before, you can actually group this into a collection, and you can run entire test suites against this to see which one's going to cost you the less to run against a set of APIs. Like very easy. Nice. Visualize. Yeah. There's some really cool stuff that we've built there that I would encourage people to check out. So that's just being able to interact with AI and understand which models do I use. Like, how do I work with this? Kind of like I would with any API.
Yep.
The second thing is that Flows itself started as, it is this visual low code, no code builder, this workflow builder. Mm-hmm. But what's really cool is that Postman has this API network, right? And so not only is it just, hey, here's a bunch of stuff out there, but it's high quality. So this is where PayPal hosts their APIs. This is where Salesforce hosts their APIs. And so while you're actually building, you can use, Slack Dot, and it will add the APIs that are high quality in the network that those companies have put onto Postman's network. And developers can come in and quickly chain those together to build these workflows, these flows, right? And now what you've done is you've been able to add essentially non-deterministic AI calls. And so you can take, grab this data from Slack, do this thing from Salesforce, and then, hey, by the way, go pass this to this LLM code block and come back and do something. And then you can continue the flow. So that gives this like really incredible superpower to just these workflows, these flows. Now the question becomes, how do you up level that to agents, right? Now the agents get really interesting here, where now you want the agent to be able to have access to the API. So it's no longer an oracle. So before we talked about kind of the AI is more of an oracle, where in this step, tell me yes or no, or categorize it in 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I will do something with whatever you say. This now is moving to the world where the agent itself is starting to act on the world. And how they act on the world is through those interfaces. And that's where I think Model Context Protocol comes in that it is giving a consistent, standardized way to be able to access these various API resources. And what we call that essentially is like tools, right? You want to give access to the tools. So if I build an agent, it doesn't have access to my Dropbox at the moment. It doesn't have access to my Figma. It doesn't have access to my tools. Right. And so how do I give it access to tools, and, in what capacity? And so I think this is the big security question. It's kind of like, remember all the auth flows where like those evolved so much where, hey, just auth, like, give Slack everything you want or give Atlassian everything you want versus, hey, here's like the 3 things it's going to take, and let you check boxes on, do you want read writes on this versus that? I think you'll probably need to have something similar with what exactly can this AI do? What are the mechanisms to replay those events? Like what happens if it does make wrong decisions?
Yeah.
Right. And so I think the model context protocol just provides, it's almost like, if I were to think about it, it's almost like what GraphQL did to HTTP. You want to optimize for the consumer. So you're optimizing for AI to not go stitch together all of these REST endpoints. For a given company, you're not going to expose 100% of your endpoints.
Right.
So you think about like, hey, what's the set I should expose? And how do I kind of group that? That expression is kind of the model context protocols. You're expressing it in like a consistent format that these AI agents know to work with.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just a huge advantage for the whole industry to be able to reason across this. And Postman's, allowing we're already working on this, being able to call out to those MCP and get results back and then start to add those to your agents. So as you build out in flows and you build your agents, you can actually manage what tools you give access to. Yeah. And so that's what people are trying to solve. Like, how do you put all this together really so that you can build these effective agents? They are solving actual business problems,
right? Right.
And you can manage those ongoing. A lot of people forget about the cost ongoing and what happens, to your point, or what I was saying earlier, of like, if it makes a mistake, where does that go? How does it get audited?
Right. Yeah, no, just a ton of things. It's kind of, I mean, it's a fascinating time because we are giving so many more people the ability to have kind of the power to go create this stuff. AI is making it somewhat easier. The beauty of it is so many of the things behind the scenes, like you said, how you do governance, how you do versioning, how you make it efficient. Like you guys have solved a ton of those problems, and now it's just bringing that to kind of a different context. And it's very, very cool to see. It's awesome to see people that are just super passionate about this space and are constantly thinking about like how to make things simpler for developers, because so many things are kind of on their shoulders these days. There's just so much, challenges that they have in terms of keeping up and learning new stuff. And so it's very cool to hear all this. I know we dove into a million things. We will put a ton of stuff in the show notes for folks because, if you're like me, Taylor gave you a million things to go think about and you're going to want to go read about them. So a last question, obviously, go to the website to get stuff, but are there places if people are engaging with you or engaging with some of the new stuff that's like sort of the best place to go to either learn about it or, kind of get engaged with the teams?
Oh yeah, great question. So it would just be, you can go to postman.com. Mm-hmm. We have our community where you can see some of our kind of drops, like our newsletters, where you can see all the new capabilities coming out kind of each month. I would encourage you to check that out. And then we do have like the academy or the learning area where you can just dive in and you want to see, how do I work with APIs? And then we're slowly adding more content to that's related to some of these newer aspects around AI and other things. But the core Postman is still there and we're making it better every day. So that's the place to check it out.
Very cool. Very cool. Good stuff. Taylor, thank you so much for the time today. I learned a ton of stuff. I know we went into a whole lot of topics for folks. So, for everybody who listens, thank you. On behalf of Aaron and I, we want to thank Taylor for his time. Again, there will be a bunch of things in the show notes so you can kind of catch up to all the things that we talked about. With that, I want to thank everybody for listening. Again, I want to thank Taylor for his time, and we'll wrap up and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.